found a hidden room in my apartment, and what I discovered changed everything. I've lived in my apartment for 3 years now, and up until last week, I thought I knew every inch of it. It's not a huge place, just a small one-bedroom in an older building with creaky floors and slightly uneven walls. The rent was reasonable, the neighbors kept to themselves, and besides the occasional plumbing issue, everything seemed fine. At least, that's what I thought. It all started when my landlord texted me about a leak in the unit below mine. He asked if I'd noticed any water damage in my apartment. I hadn't, but to be sure, I went around checking under the sink, behind the toilet, and along the baseboards. Everything looked normal. That was until I got to the hall closet. Now, this closet was tiny, barely big enough for a few coats and a vacuum cleaner. I rarely used it, so I hadn't paid much attention to it over the years. But as I ran my hand along the back wall, I felt something off. A draft, which made no sense. There shouldn't have been a draft coming from inside a closet with no vents, no windows, and only one entrance. Curious, I knocked on the back wall. Hollow. I knocked again, a little harder this time. The panel shifted. That's when I knew something was there. I always considered myself a rational person. Logical. Grounded. The kind of guy who double-checks the locks at night, keeps track of his expenses, and never falls for conspiracy theories. So when I found a hidden door in my apartment, something that had apparently been there the whole time, I felt my entire worldview take a sharp, unexpected turn. It started with something simple, a draft. I lived in this apartment for 2 years. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest one-bedroom in an old building that had probably seen better days. It creaked at night, the plumbing made questionable noises, and the heating system had a mind of its own. But it was cheap, and in the city, that was all that mattered. One evening, as I was lounging on my couch, mindlessly scrolling through Reddit, I felt it, a faint, cold breeze on the back of my neck. At first, I brushed it off. Old buildings had drafts. Maybe a window wasn't closed all the way, or there was a crack in the wall I hadn't noticed before. As the days went by, I kept feeling it, always in the same spot near the corner of my living room. Then came the sound. It was subtle at first, like a faint rustling, a whisper of movement where there shouldn't be any. I told myself it was the pipes, the wind, the building settling, anything but what my gut was starting to tell me. One night, I decided to investigate. I ran my hands along the wall where the draft was strongest, pressing against the old, slightly peeling wallpaper. That's when I felt it, a seam. Thin, almost imperceptible line that shouldn't have been there. My heart pounded as I traced it, my fingers pressing against the wall. And then, with a soft click, a section of the wall shifted inward. I stumbled back, staring in shock as an arrow, hidden door creaked open. I stared at the hidden door, my breath shallow. This wasn't normal. Apartments didn't just come with secret doors. 1,000 thoughts ran through my mind. Had the previous tenant built this? Was it some kind of maintenance access? Was my landlord hiding something? I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to not go in, to call someone first, to not be the idiot in a horror movie who investigates alone. But this wasn't a horror movie. This was my apartment. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and stepped inside. The space beyond was narrow, almost claustrophobic. Dust clung to the air, swirling in the beam of my phone's light. The walls were rough, unfinished, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of grime. It wasn't a room. It was more like a passageway. I took a few cautious steps forward, my heart pounding with every creak of the old wood beneath my feet. The air was stale, carrying a faint, musty scent. But beneath that, there was something else, something metallic. The hallway extended further than I expected, turning sharply to the right. I followed it, feeling an eerie sense of displacement. This was inside my apartment. It had always been here. How had I never noticed? Then I saw it. At the end of the passage, there was another door. This one was different, made of metal, with a heavy, rusted handle. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over it. And then I heard something behind me. Sound, faint, almost like breathing. I spun around, my flashlight darting across the empty hallway. Nothing. Just dust and silence. Swallowing hard, I turned back to the door. Whatever was behind here, I had to know. I gripped the handle, bracing myself, and pulled. The door groaned as it swung open, the sound echoing down the narrow passage. A stale rush of air hit me, thick with dust and something else, something metallic, almost like rust. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a small, windowless room. It was barely larger than a walk-in closet, but it was filled with stuff. A desk, an old wooden chair, and a corkboard covered in yellowed papers. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, unlit. I stepped inside cautiously, sweeping my light across the room. Walls were lined with shelves, stacked haphazardly with books, folders, and cassette tapes. I picked one up, turning it over in my hands. It was unlabeled. Just a plain black cassette, its surface slightly sticky with age. An old tape recorder sat on the desk. Dust covered its buttons, but it looked functional. My fingers hovered over it. Every instinct told me to not press play. But curiosity won. I clicked the play button. At first, nothing, just a low hum, the crackle of old tape. Then a voice. Familiar voice. If you found this, it means you live here now. I froze. That voice, it sounded like me. Not exactly. A little different, but close enough that my entire body went cold. The recording continued. This apartment isn't what you think it is, and if you found this room, then it's already started. I slammed the stop button, my heart hammering. What the hell was this? I stumbled back, my breathing uneven. The room, the tape, the hidden passage, none of this made sense. And then, the worst part, the door, the metal door I had just opened. It was now closed, and I hadn't shut it. The room spun. My vision blurred at the edges, and a wave of dizziness crashed over me like I'd just stood up too fast, except I hadn't moved. I gripped the edge of the desk for balance, my breath shallow. The air fell heavier, pressing against my chest, making it harder to think. Get out. I forced myself to turn, nearly stumbling as I moved toward the door. My limbs felt sluggish, uncoordinated, like I was walking through water. The handle felt ice cold in my grip as I yanked it open. I barely remembered making it back to the main apartment. My head throbbed, my vision tunneled, and by the time I reached the couch, my legs gave out beneath me. It swallowed me whole. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the blinds. My head was clear. My body felt normal. No dizziness, no strange pressure in my chest, just the distant hum of morning traffic and the warmth of daylight filtering into the room. I sat up slowly, rubbing my face. A dream. It had to be a dream. I glanced around. Everything in my apartment looked the same. No dust-covered cassette tapes, no hidden doors, just my normal, slightly messy living room. I let out a breath, almost laughing at myself. Of course, it was a dream. I'd probably just fallen asleep on the couch and had some weird, feverish nightmare. Maybe I'd been dehydrated or something. Shaking my head, I pushed myself up and went about my day, trying to shake off the lingering unease. By the time night fell, I'd convinced myself it was nothing, until I heard it. A low, groaning creak, coming from beneath my feet. I froze. It wasn't my neighbors, wasn't the building settling. It was coming from below, from the hidden room, from the door I had never reopened. Sound crawled up my spine like icy fingers, a slow, dragging creak. The kind of noise wood makes when something heavy shifts against it. I sat there, frozen on the couch, every nerve in my body on edge. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was a pipe expanding or some weird plumbing issue. But then another creak. Louder this time, closer. I swallowed hard. My throat felt dry. I stood up slowly, my bare feet singing into the carpet. Apartment was dead silent except for the faint hum of my fridge. My pulse pounded in my ears. You imagine it, go back to sleep, but I couldn't. Because now that I was listening, really listening, I could hear something else. A faint, rhythmic sound, a soft, slow tapping, not random, not the kind of noise a house makes when it settles, deliberate, like fingertips drumming lightly against wood, right beneath me. My stomach twisted into a tight knot. The dream, what I thought was a dream, came rushing back all at once. The hidden door, the tapes, the dizziness. Had I really imagined it? Took a shaky breath and stepped forward. The tapping stopped instantly. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. I stood there, heart hammering, my skin prickling with something I couldn't explain. I wanted to move, to do something, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was down there was waiting. I had two choices. I could ignore it, pretend I'd never heard anything, lock my bedroom door and force myself to sleep. Or I could go down there and find out what was waiting for me. I swallowed hard, my fingers curling into fists at my sides. Every logical part of my brain screamed at me to go back to bed, to pretend I never heard anything. But my body was already moving. I grabbed my phone, not to call for help, just to have something in my hand, and made my way to the closet. The air felt heavier the closer I got, like I was wading through something invisible but suffocating. I hesitated in front of the fake back wall, my fingers hovering over the seam. I didn't want to open it, but I had to. With a deep breath, I pressed my palms against the panel and pushed. It swung open easily, too easily, like someone had already been here. Scent hit me immediately, a mix of old wood, stale air, and something else. Something sharp and metallic like rusted iron. I swallowed down my nerves and stepped inside. The small underground room looked exactly as I remembered it, dusty, cramped, filled with ancient-looking filing cabinets and that old TV set. My eyes flickered toward the pile of VHS tapes stacked neatly on the floor. My heart pounded against my ribs. Just one, I told myself. Just watch one, then leave. Crouched down and picked up a tape at random. It had no label, just a piece of yellowed masking tape stretched across the front. The words Session 4 were scrawled in shaky black marker. I swallowed hard and slid the tape into the player. The screen flickered, static crackling through the tiny speakers. Then the image stabilized. Dimly lit room appeared on screen. Chair sat in the center, metal and rusted. Leather straps dangled from its arms. And in that chair, person, they were slumped forward, their head lolling to the side, their face hidden by a mess of dark, unkempt hair. Voice crackled through the speakers, low and measured. State your name. No response. The voice sighed. Again, state your name. Still nothing. Then, person lifted their head. And my blood ran cold. Because even through the grainy footage, even with their face battered and bruised, I knew them. It was my landlord. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. It didn't make sense. My landlord, Mr. Halway, was a quiet, no-nonsense guy in his late 50s. He lived 2 floors up, barely spoke to tenants except when collecting rent, and had the kind of face you'd forget in a crowd. Here he was, on this tape, strapped to a chair, looking like he had been through hell. The screen flickered slightly and the voice came again. You're making this harder than it needs to be. A long silence. Then Mr. Halway, disheveled, barely conscious, muttered something. I couldn't make it out. The voice sighed, then spoke again. We'll continue tomorrow. The screen cut to static. I exhaled shakily, realizing I had been holding my breath. My hands were sweating. My mind raced with questions. When was this filmed? It was behind the camera, and most importantly, why was my landlord in this room? I reached for another tape. This one was labeled Session 5. I hesitated. Do I really want to see this? But my hands moved before my brain could answer. I slid the tape in. The screen flickered to life. The same room, the same chair, only this time, Mr. Halway wasn't tied down. He was standing, talking, and the person holding the camera was nodding along like they were agreeing with him. I turned up the volume. It was never supposed to be permanent, Halway was saying, his voice hoarse but steady. It was only a test. The camera shifted slightly. A test of what? The unseen person asked. A pause, then in a quieter voice. Control, I shivered. Mr. Halway rubbed his wrists like he was remembering the straps. You have no idea what you're dealing with. The screen went black. Then the soft click of the tape ejecting. I sat there, stunned, my pulse pounding in my ears. This wasn't just some twisted torture video. This was something else, something bigger. Somehow, my landlord was in the middle of it. I froze in place, the last remnants of the video still running through my head like a reel that wouldn't stop spinning. My heart was hammering in my chest, and the cold sweat on my palms made it hard to grip the cassette player properly. I could feel the air in the room growing heavier, like the walls themselves were pressing in. I needed to know more, everything. I couldn't just sit here and let this spiral further into madness. I stumbled toward the desk, my legs still shaky from what I'd just witnessed. On the far side of the room, buried under old folders and unused junk, was a stack of papers. I hadn't noticed it before, not with everything that had been going on, but now it was almost like it was calling to me. With a shaking hand, I reached for the top file. It was labeled Project Haven Classified. Cold shiver ran down my spine. I opened it. Inside were pages of documents, some yellowed, some with fresh ink, and a few that looked like they had been typed in a hurry. They were all neatly stacked, each one a piece of the puzzle I didn't even know existed. The first page had a brief summary. Project Haven is an experimental study in human behavior and control mechanisms. The subject, referred to as the testee, will undergo a series of psychological and physical trials to determine the efficacy of covert manipulation. The project's long-term goal is to explore methods of persuasion, influence, and behavior modification. I blinked, rereading the sentence several times, my mind racing to make sense of it. Behavior modification, covert manipulation. This wasn't a simple, isolated incident. This was something calculated, something planned. My hands trembled as I flipped through more pages. The documents described various stages of the experiment, each more chilling than the last. There were notes about psychological tests, physical endurance challenges, and methods for controlling reactions. It mentioned subjects being exposed to extreme environmental stressors to see how they would adapt. Then I found a section labeled Participant History, Subject Hallway. I skimmed the section, the words burning into my mind. It was all about Mr. Halloway, his background, his personality profile, even his health history. It seemed like they knew everything about him. The document described his childhood, his work history, and his gradual descent into the test, how they had manipulated his career choices to steer him toward their experiment. The chilling part, it outlined his willingness to comply with the program, how they had manipulated him into believing that his participation was necessary for a greater cause. Then, it mentioned something that made my blood run cold. Termination of test subject, pending. The note was brief, almost offhand, but the implications were unmistakable. My landlord, Mr. Halloway, had been part of some twisted experiment, and the experiment had reached a point where his removal was being considered. But why? Was it because he had outlived his usefulness, or was it because he had started to question everything? I felt a lump in my throat. This wasn't just some random secret room in the basement. It was a controlled, calculated environment where lives were manipulated for a twisted purpose. And Mr. Halloway wasn't just some innocent bystander. He was deep in it. I flipped to the next page, my hands shaking as I tried to keep reading through the blur of ink and chaos. The following pages were even more disturbing. They outlined plans for subject recruitment and confidential operations designed to recruit more participants. The documents hinted at an underground network of people who had been lured in under false pretenses, each one unknowingly becoming part of a much larger, far-reaching experiment. One last page stood out. Current status of Project Haven. It was a symbol chart, but the final column made my heart stop. Let us read. All subjects, including Halloway, are to be reprogrammed, reassigned, and monitored for the next 6 months. Operation will continue as scheduled. Full termination of all participants will take place upon completion of Phase 4. What the hell was Phase 4? Couldn't believe what I was reading. My landlord, this quiet, unassuming man, had been a part of something far bigger, something that had nothing to do with real estate. The twisted mind games, the experiments, the control. And I had just stumbled into it. Suddenly, a noise from the other room broke my concentration, a door creaking open. My blood ran cold. I was alone. I knew the air felt wrong in here, like something wasn't quite right. But this was too much. I gathered the papers together, stuffing them in my bag, trying to make as little noise as possible. I wasn't sure how much time I had, but it felt like the walls were closing in around me. I had to get out of there before someone came back. My heart was pounding in my chest. I barely had enough time to react when I heard the soft scrape of a door opening, one I hadn't noticed before. The air in the room shifted, becoming heavier, almost suffocating. My pulse raced as I instinctively crouched down behind the old, rusted filing cabinet, my eyes darting toward the entrance. The shadows in the room were growing longer, but I stayed as still as possible, trying to slow my breathing. I could hear the sound of footsteps. The crunch of something soft beneath boots, maybe. The figures moved quickly, their movements jerky and unnatural. I couldn't see their faces at first. The figures were wearing large, dark masks, nothing like the usual bandanas or ski masks you see on criminals. These were more elaborate, twisted almost, like they were meant to distort their features entirely. Their bodies were oddly shaped too, as if they weren't quite human, tall and lanky with elongated limbs that made their movements look strange. But it wasn't just that. There was something about them, something wrong. They felt like they didn't belong in this space. I barely dared to breathe. We were in the room for what felt like an eternity, their footsteps echoing off the walls, the floorboards creaking under their weight. I could hear them whispering to each other in a low, guttural tone I couldn't understand, like some language that didn't belong to this world. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my mind screamed that I should run, that I should get out of there before it was too late. But I couldn't move, not yet. I shuffled around the room for what felt like hours, touching things, inspecting corners, picking up discarded objects. And just when I thought they might notice me, one of them walked within inches of my hiding spot. My heart skipped a beat, but I held my breath, praying they wouldn't see me. I was hidden in the darkest corner, the one farthest from the light. Finally, they stopped. The door creaked again as the figures shuffled out, moving as silently as they had entered. I waited in total silence, too scared to move for a good few minutes, until their footsteps faded entirely. My body was shaking uncontrollably, but I knew I couldn't wait in longer. I slowly rose from my crouch, my legs sore and stiff. My mind was still reeling. What had just happened? Were those people? Or whatever they were real, or had I imagined it? The way they moved, the way they seemed almost inhuman, it couldn't be real, could it? I moved to the desk, my hands trembling as I reached for the pile of documents. My stomach churned with the growing sense of dread. I had to find the papers. I had to know the truth. But when I opened the drawer, my stomach sank. The papers, the files, the recordings, everything was gone. I stood there, dumbfounded, staring at the empty space. No, it couldn't be. They had been right here. I saw them. I scanned the room in a blind panic, but there was nothing. No sign of the documents. No sign of anything that had been there before. My chest tightened. The room felt colder now, darker, like it was mocking me. It was as though everything I'd uncovered had been erased in an instant. Cold sweat broke out over my skin. Had they taken it? The figures? Were they the ones behind this? No, this couldn't be happening. I must have imagined it. I took a step back, my mind swirling in confusion. The door I hadn't noticed earlier, the figures and masks, the disappearance of the papers, it all felt like I was losing grip on reality. I was going mad. Maybe I never found anything in the first place. Maybe the whole thing had been a dream. I spun around and bolted for the door, not daring to look back. My breath came in short, ragged bursts, my thoughts still fogged by the panic coursing through me. I couldn't stand being in that room for another second. I had to leave. I had to get out before I lost my mind completely. But as I reached the doorway, something in my gut told me it wasn't over. The feeling of being watched, the sensation that something or someone was still lurking in the shadows, it wouldn't leave me. The hairs on my neck stood up again. My pulse hammered in my ears. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see those figures standing in the doorway, waiting for me. But there was nothing, just the eerie silence of the room. I quickly left the basement, trying to shake off the overwhelming dread that had taken hold of me. Every step I took toward the stairs felt like I was leaving something behind, something important, something I couldn't understand. But in my heart, I knew it wasn't the end. It couldn't be. There was something I was missing, something big. And the thought that kept circling my mind. What if everything I had discovered, every document, every secret room, was just the beginning? What if I was only scratching the surface of something much darker? Something I had no business stumbling into? I didn't want to know the answer, but deep down, I knew it was too late to turn back now. Days after the incident felt like a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I didn't know who to trust or what to believe anymore. The room, the documents, the strange figures, everything seemed to be slipping through my fingers like sand. I had no one to talk to about it, no one who would believe me. I spent hours packing around my apartment, wondering if I was losing my mind. The more I thought about it, the more I questioned what had actually happened. Could it have all been a hallucination? Maybe the stress had finally caught up with me, and I was seeing things. I wanted to believe that was the case, but something inside me told me it was. In desperation, I reached out to my closest friends. I told them everything, trying to explain what had happened in that room. I told them about the hidden door, the figures and masks, the missing documents. I even mentioned the strange sense of dread that had clung to me ever since. First, they just stared at me like I was insane. "Man, you're just stressed out," Mike said, rubbing his eyes. "Maybe you need to take a break, go get some fresh air." I could see the disbelief in their faces, but I pushed on. "No, you don't understand. There's something down there, something I can't explain. Please, you have to help me check it out." After a long pause, they reluctantly agreed to come by the next day. I tried to keep my hope in check, but deep down, I was terrified. What if they went down there and didn't find anything? What if it was all just in my head? The next day, they arrived at my apartment, skeptical but willing to take a look. We made our way down to the basement, and I tried to act normal, but I could feel my anxiety creeping up again. What if it was all gone? What if everything had disappeared? We reached the hidden room, but when we pulled back the rug and looked at the wall, my heart sank. The secret door was gone. The wall was solid, untouched. No trace of the door, no marks to suggest it had ever been there. Just plain, boring drywall. "See," Mike said with a grin. "I told you, man, you've been working too hard. It's all in your head." I could feel my throat tightening. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But then I remembered. The figures, the documents, the strange feeling. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe I was just too shaken up to see it clearly. I ran my hand along the wall, desperately searching for any clue, any sign that something had been there. But there was nothing. I spent the next half hour checking every inch of the room, but there was nothing. No hidden doors, no documents, nothing. Just the cold, unfeeling walls of my apartment. I was crushed. I had been so sure, so confident. But now it felt like the whole thing had been a dream. I felt the weight of disappointment settle in my chest. As we were about to leave the basement, I noticed something strange. A faint, almost imperceptible smell, like damp earth, mold, and something else, something old. I paused, breathing it in. It wasn't just the musty scent of a basement. No, this was something else, something lingering. "All right, let's head back up," Mike said, sounding ready to be done with this whole mess. I nodded absently and followed them up the stairs, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe I had imagined it all, but the smell, the way the air felt, was I really just crazy? That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the events over and over. The strange figures, the documents, the missing room. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept wondering if I had just missed something, if there was some kind of hidden truth that I couldn't see. And then, something strange happened. Next morning, when I went to get my mail, I found something I hadn't expected. A letter sitting in my mailbox. It had no return address, no markings to indicate who had sent it, but I knew in my gut that it was connected to everything that had happened. I opened it with trembling hands. The letter read, "You shouldn't have looked. Now that you have, there's no going back. We're always watching. We know what you found. We will be waiting for the day you try again." I stood there, frozen, staring at the words, my heart pounding in my chest. Was this real? Had someone else been watching me? Were the figures I had seen, the documents I had found, were they really part of something much bigger? I couldn't believe it. But just as quickly as the letter arrived, it raised more questions than it answered. Was this a warning? Was I being followed? Had my friends been right all along? Or had something or someone been in that room after all? As I stared at the letter, one question echoed through my mind. Was this just the beginning? I couldn't know for sure. But I also knew I couldn't let it go.